Hey everyone, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. This is from the chapter on the Permanent Revolution. The section that I'm reading is titled Permanent Revolution, Scope and Limits. The words, quote, permanent revolution do not appear in Results and Prospects. In Results and Prospects, as we have seen, Trotsky referred to his conception of the Russian Revolution as that of a, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote. Quote, permanent revolution came to be generally used in later years to identify Trotsky's ideas, but it is fairly certain that that it was not Trotsky himself who first coined this, quote, title. I'm going to repeat this sentence. I feel like I fucked it up. Quote, permanent revolution came to be generally used in later years to identify Trotsky's idea, but it's fairly certain that it was not Trotsky himself who first coined this, quote, title, although Trotsky referred to it in an article of 1908. Footnote, the article was first published in the Polish journal Something in Polish, under the title Something in Polish, which apparently translates as Over What Do We Differ? The Russian version is in Trotsky's 1905. See especially pages 272 to 3. This appears to be the first time that Trotsky used the words, quote, permanent revolution, end quote. In the first Russian edition of 1905, the article appears in an incomplete form, with some passages, included in all subsequent editions, missing. End footnote. Although Trotsky referred to the term permanent revolution in an article of 1908, it would seem that by 1908, this is how his theory of the revolution was already dubbed by others. Footnote. According to Trotsky, in the above article, the Menshevik Martynov thus referred to the theory. End footnote. Nevertheless, he did not, in this article, object to the title, though he objected to the, quote, vulgarization of the idea by its opponents, and, in subsequent years, Trotsky was to use the term permanent revolution regularly himself without ever raising the question of the permanent revolutions as a term's appropriateness. Footnote. See 1905, page 272, where Trotsky stated that he never claimed, as had been attributed to him, that Russia could leap straight into socialism. End footnote. In the 1919 preface to the Russian reissue of Results and Prospects, Trotsky presented the contents of the book as an analysis of the, quote, viewpoint of the permanent revolution, end quote, which Trotsky had, quote, maintained in the course of 15 years, end quote. And in the 1922 preface to the first Russian edition of 1905, the book, we may recall, originally appeared in German in 1910, although Trotsky said of, quote, permanent revolution that it was a somewhat, quote, sententious expression, end quote. Trotsky readily accepted and used the appellation. Thereafter, of course, Trotsky always referred to permanent revolution as, quote, my theory of the permanent revolution, end quote, though using the title interchangeably with the phrase, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote, as in the book The Permanent Revolution, which we have discussed above. Footnote. Trotsky persisted in using this, quote, title, even though by then the words, quote, permanent revolution had acquired an anti-Leninist label in the Soviet Union. End footnote. Whoever first coined the term, quote, permanent revolution, however, and whatever Trotsky's conception of the term permanent revolution, there is no doubt that it was an unfortunate choice, and not only because it is obviously non-Russian in origin. We have used it throughout this study because that is how the theory it designates came to be known, and that is how, after all, Trotsky himself agreed to call it but it is somewhat sententious or bombastic, and the term permanent revolution is even misleading. The term permanent revolution has sometimes been taken to mean the idea of an unending, internally ongoing transformation in the lives of men, a kind of, quote, permanent, end quote, state of deliberate change of one's environment, and perhaps even revolt against it. Footnote: similarities between it and the revolutionary ideas attributed to Mao Zedong have also been noted, as Stuart R. Schramm, The Political Thought of Mao Zedong, published in C. Stuart R. Schramm's The Political Thought of Mao Zedong, published in 1969. See also Li Chen-chung, Trotsky's Theory of the Permanent Revolution, of the, quote, permanent revolution, and Mao Zedong's Theory of the, quote, continuous revolution, published in Issues and Studies, 1972. Trotsky, however, is considered a heretic no less in China than in the Soviet Union. End footnote. End footnote. Neither this nor some metaphysical senses which have been attributed to it has anything to do with Trotsky's meaning. As Trotsky would say in later years, the idea of, quote, permanent revolt seems to me simply nonsense. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote: nor does Trotsky's use of the term permanent revolution bear any relation to its meaning in Sigmund Neumann's Permanent Revolution, Totalitarianism in the Age of International Civil War, published in 1965, or Bertrand de Jouvenel's Power, the Natural History of Its Growth. Sorry, I'm looking something up. My computer's kind of like shitting its pants, so... Sorry. I know this is annoying, but... I'm seeing if any of these titles have any descriptions of them. It looks like Zygmunt Neumann's Permanent Revolution has a description. It says, permanent revolution stands out as a classic study of the social structure of totalitarian rule. The problem of totalitarianism and democracy is still with us, and Neumann's dictum, quote, that it is much more than a problem of constitutional structure of economic progress. It is above all the difference in basic human concepts, end quote, is as valid today as it was in 1942. Neumann's analysis of dictatorship opens a new approach to political dynamism for the democracies, for it deals ultimately with a lasting problem, the dignity and personal responsibility of the individual. That's a preface from Hans Kohl to Zygmunt Neumann's Permanent Revolution, Totalitarianism in the Age of International Civil War. Let's see if there's anything for this. Bertrand Juvenel's Power, the Natural History of Its Growth. The description for Bertrand Juvenel's On Power, the Natural History of Its Growth says, the description says, documenting the process by which government and controlling majorities have grown increasingly powerful and tyrannical, Bertrand de Juvenel demonstrates how democracies have failed to limit the powers of government. Juvenel traces this development to the days of royal absolutism, which established large administrative bureaucracies and thus laid the foundation of the modern omnipotent state. So, back to the text and footnote. The theory Trotsky promulgated pertained to the specific historical context of a country, such as Russia was at the beginning of the 20th century, and was intended to explain the specific possibility of combining a bourgeois with a proletarian revolution. But, quote, permanent hardly describes this process, since it is not an unending process, and there is nothing eternal about it. Indeed, quote, uninterrupted, that is, moving without a break or pause from one historical conjunction, the bourgeois, to another, the socialist, was the best choice of term. Quote, continuous, or even, quote, expanding, would have also been more appropriate than, quote, permanent, for a continuity of stages and expansion of revolutionary tasks were ideas at the very core of the theory. But we shall not quibble over semantics. Obviously, what is important is to grasp the content of the theory. The name by which the theory goes need not detract us from the substance of that content, and in view of the fact that the theory has become famous by that name, it would be hopeless, probably, and perhaps pedantic, to rename permanent revolution at so late a date. There is, however, another reason for retaining the name as it came to be known, and that is the phrase, quote, permanent revolution, with a slight variation, is to be found in none other than Karl Marx himself, although the idea of a continuous revolution seems to have originated in French socialist circles during the second quarter of the 19th century. Footnote, see J.L. Talman, Political Messianism, The Romantic Phase, published in 1960. I don't see any description for that. And I don't see any description for J.L. Talman. See also Short's The Revolution of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Let's see. The description says, English translation of a Russian language study of political problems in the USSR, with particular reference to the interaction of the socialist movement and the communist labor movement, refers to the revolution of 1905 and covers historical aspects of Bolshevik and Menshevik political leadership, the role of political parties and intellectuals, strikes, trade unionism, etc. So, back to the text and footnote. Although the idea of a continuous revolution seems to have originated in French socialist circles during the second quarter of the 19th century, and the words, quote, la révolution en permanence even appear in Proudhon, the meaning which is closest to that of Trotsky's intention is clearly evident only in some of Marx's writing. Footnote. See Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's Idées Révolutionnaires, published in 1849. Proudhon and other French socialists had in mind the idea of a continuous revolution transforming the lives of men and finally culminating in a socialist society. This, of course, has little to do with Trotsky's notion of the permanent revolution as a revolutionary characteristic of a backward society. End footnote. To see the affinity, therefore, as well as the differences, and thereby the place of Trotsky's theory within the Marxist canon and tradition, it seems worthwhile to look briefly at Marx's use of the phrase and the idea. The phrase permanent revolution occurs twice in the well-known 1850 address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. Footnote. Marx first used the term, quote, permanent revolution in 1843, see his On the Jewish Question, and again in 1844 in the work with Engels, The Holy Family, where Marx wrote that Napoleon had, quote, substituted permanent war for permanent revolution, end quote. But Marx's meaning in both instances seems to have been more figurative than literal. However, in another 1843 article, without using the term itself, Marx already hinted at the idea he would express in 1850. Speaking of the political backwardness of Germany, Marx noted that, quote, the struggle against the political present of the Germans is a struggle against the past of the modern nations, ... In politics, the Germans have thought what other nations have done, end quote. Marx, Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Introduction. The glaring gap between German reality and the reality of advanced nations, Marx argued, made Germany more vulnerable to a radical revolution. Since, however, Marx's early writings remained unknown until the 1920s, they have no relevance in the present context of the development of the idea of the permanent revolution. End footnote. Discussing the objectives towards which the League should strive, Marx declared, quote, while the democratic petty bourgeois wish to bring the revolution to a conclusion as quick as possible, it is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent, until all more or less possessing classes have been forced out of their position of dominance, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and the association of proletarians, not only in one country, but in all the dominant countries of the world, has advanced so far that competition among the proletarians of these countries has ceased, and that at least the decisive productive forces are concentrated in the hands of the proletarians, end quote. Marx. And in the concluding passage of the address, Marx stated, quote, bracket, the German workers, end bracket, themselves must do the utmost for the German workers' final victory by clarifying the German workers' minds as to what the German workers' class interests are, by taking up their position as an independent party as soon as possible, and by not allowing themselves to be seduced for a single moment by the hypocritical phrases of the democratic petty bourgeois into refraining from the independent organization of the party of the proletariat. Their battle cry must be the revolution in permanence. End quote, Marx. In the same year, that is 1850, Marx wrote and published the long and also well-known article, The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. Here, too, the idea of a, quote, permanent revolution, end quote, is mentioned directly. It comes in the context of a definition of what Marx called, quote, revolutionary socialism, end quote, in France. Quote, ... The proletariat rallies more and more around revolutionary socialism, around communism, for which the bourgeoisie has itself invented the name of Blanqui. This socialism is the declaration of the permanence of the revolution. The declaration of the permanence of the revolution. It is the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transition point to the abolition of class distinctions generally. to the abolition of all the social relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that result from these social relations." End quote. Marx. The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. Footnote. This passage is immediately followed by the sentence, quote, "The scope of this exposition does not permit of developing the subject further," end quote. End footnote. This is the last time that Marx referred to the subject of permanent revolution directly, though Marx's 1882 preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto may be seen as implying the idea anew in a different context. On the basis of these three references alone, it is difficult to gather the precise meaning which Marx attached to, quote, permanent revolution, but the general conception becomes clearer when analyzed in the particular context of the period of 1848 to 1850. The notion of the proletariat as a, quote, universal class, which would liberate not only the proletariat itself, but the whole of society, is to be found in the earliest of Marx's writings. Footnote. See in particular the previously mentioned contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, introduction, at the end of which Marx speaks of the complete, quote, emancipation of Germany is possible only through the proletariat. End footnote. That the notion should have arisen in the context, in fact, of the German situation of the time was not fortuitous. Already in the early 1840s, Marx was preoccupied by the fact not only of Germany's retarded social and political development in comparison with England or France, but also of the apparent inability of the German bourgeoisie to rise to a dominating position in German society, even at so late a date. Marx stressed, however, that a proletariat had begun to constitute itself as a significant political force in Germany before a bourgeois revolution. Thus, the idea that Germany's political development might follow a path different from that of England and France had already impressed itself upon Marx in the early 1840s and grew for Marx out of the very backwardness which Marx perceived in Germany. Marx thus contemplated the prospect of a truly radical revolution in German society because of this, hitherto unique, historical juxtaposition of bourgeoisie and proletariat. Footnote. It is thus interesting that Marx's view of the proletariat as a revolutionary class was first formed in the context of a, quote, backward Germany, and only later in the context of the, quote, advanced nations. End footnote. In 1848, in the Communist Manifesto, at a time when the prospects of a bourgeois revolution in Germany looked propitious, he nevertheless stressed again the importance of the proletariat. Quote, "The communists turn the communist attention chiefly to Germany, because Germany is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England in the 17th and of England in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution." End quote. Marx. This passage is significant in a number of respects. Firstly, it shows explicitly Marx's grasp of the fact that a belated bourgeois revolution in Germany, carried out when some other countries of Europe were at a more advanced stage, must be different in character from previous bourgeois revolutions. On the basis of this passage alone, it is clear that Marx's view of the possibilities of social development was not uniform or mechanistic. Secondly, the expectation that a proletarian revolution would follow, quote, immediately, suggests that Marx contemplated a kind of momentum within the revolution, which would carry the revolution beyond the revolution's initial ostensible goals. The affinity of this as of the previous point, to Trotsky's later theory of the permanent revolution in Russia is obvious enough so as to require no comment. Thirdly, however, it is also clear that Marx still envisaged the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions as separate, even if now directly interrelated stages. Whatever the time gap between these revolutions, Marx saw these revolutions as distinct events. By 1850, however, the prospects of a bourgeois revolution in Germany had subsided, and Marx's optimism of 1848 was replaced by obvious disappointment and despair with the emerging reality. As has often been noted, for a short period during that year, Marx appears to have adopted an almost, quote, Blanquist attitude toward revolution. Footnote: for different interpretations of Marx's attitude during the 1848 to 1850 period, see Shlomo Avineri's The Social and Political Thought of Karl Marx, published in 1968, and George Lichtheim's Marxism, A Historical and Critical Study, published in 1964. End footnote. The address and the class struggles, in any case, clearly indicate that Marx's position had become very radical and very impatient indeed. Was the consequent stratagem of the, quote, revolution in permanence, end quote, tantamount to the idea which arose for Trotsky more than a half-century later in Russia? There are a number of reasons for thinking that it was not, in fact, an exact precedent. In the first place, although the passages from the address and the class struggle which have been quoted suggest that Marx, at least momentarily, envisaged a more direct revolutionary role for the proletariat, both in Germany and in France, they also show that only in the case of France did Marx anticipate a workers' government, a, quote, class dictatorship. But since France was a post-bourgeois advanced nation, such an expectation is not at variance with Marx's standard, quote, timetable for the socialist revolution. In the context of France, therefore, the use of the term, quote, permanence of the revolution, end quote, may be taken to be simply a declaration to go unrelentingly beyond the half measures of non-communist socialist movements and pursue immediately full revolutionary socialist goals. In the case of Germany, the question of an immediate workers' government does not arise at all. On the contrary, the passage from the address, where Marx declared that it is, quote, our task to make revolution permanent, end quote, is followed almost immediately by the sentence, quote, that during the further development of the revolution, the petty bourgeois democracy will for a moment obtain predominating influence in Germany is not open to doubt, end quote. Marx. And in what follows, it is clear that Marx was using the expression, quote, a moment, in a figurative sense. In fact, the penultimate paragraph of the address is cautious and subordinates developments in Germany to developments in France. Quote, if the German workers are not able to attain power and achieve the German workers' own class interest without completely going through a lengthy revolutionary development, the German workers at least know for a certainty, this time, that the first act of this approaching revolutionary drama will coincide with the direct victory of their own class in France and will be very much accelerated by it. End quote. Marx. Footnote. For Trotsky's own brief, polemical, and tendentious discussion of Marx's 1850 position, see Permanent Revolution. End footnote. Thus, quote, revolution in permanence, end quote, in Germany meant to Marx at most the organization and arming of the workers as an independent political movement which will prepare itself for the period immediately following the bourgeois revolution. It meant that the workers, after such a revolution, would at once proceed with their own revolutionary campaign. Basically, therefore, the address of 1850 was a reformulation of the passage on Germany in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Although this excursion into the text of Marx shows, therefore, that, quote, the permanent revolution, end quote, did not mean to Marx what it later meant to Trotsky, It also serves to emphasize one important common feature, namely, the relationship which both saw between backwardness and revolution. As has been noted, Marx already in his earliest writings drew a connection between belated development and radical politics. During the 1848 to 1850 period, Marx translated this into actually political terms, foreseeing the prospect of accelerated revolutionary development in Germany. Thereafter, while less confident about the future of revolution in backward Germany, Marx became fascinated by the prospects of revolution in the backward East, including Russia. Footnote. Following 1850, Marx consistently opposed every Blancist revolutionary policy in Germany and elsewhere. See Avinari. And footnote. Nevertheless, Marx never worked out the full connection between backwardness and revolutionary socialism, but it remains a fact that the context within which Trotsky later formulated the theory of the permanent revolution was one which had already concentrated the mind of Marx. The importance of this affinity is not, of course, that Trotsky's ideas are somehow, legitimized, by Marx. This is irrelevant, even if it were true, and, in fact, it is not true as far as the content of these ideas is actually concerned. The importance lies rather in the historical issue of the relationship between Marxism and backward societies in the 20th century. The by now commonplace paradox of Marxist movements coming to power in such societies may be partially explained by an element which Marx already noticed and was only able to hint at, but which Trotsky eventually transformed into the revolutionary core of Marxism. It is interesting to note that while for Marx, the spectacle of revolution in the East was problematic, that while Marx remained uneasy about the shift in revolutionary activity away from Europe, which was to some extent already becoming evident in his own time, Trotsky in 1905 to 1906 saw in this the most logical of developments. In part, this is to be explained by Trotsky's adherence to the notion, which had by then become prevalent, that all nations were now engulfed within the expanding capitalist orbit. According to this view, the weakest link in the chain, as Parvis had argued in 1904, would be the first to crack. But this thesis did not explain why Marxism or social democracy should inherit the subsequent allegiance of significant social forces in a backward country. Thus, although Trotsky accepted the view that the world had become one large, capitalist camp, this was more responsible for his subsequent linkage of the Russian Revolution to events in the West than for his initial prognosis that a workers' revolution was most likely to occur first in a backward country. As we have seen, Trotsky envisaged not only a workers' revolution, not only a workers' government, but a government which would almost immediately drive towards socialist or collectivist reforms. This went beyond even what Parvis had anticipated, and Trotsky was right when Trotsky wrote in The Permanent Revolution that although Parvis's views, bordered closely on mine, they were not, identical, and, actually differed, from them. Footnote. Those quotes are from Permanent Revolution. It says, during 1905 in the German Social Democratic journal, Die Neue Zeit, articles appeared by Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, and Franz Mehring, which spoke of a, permanent revolution, in Russia. All, however, had in mind the bringing of the democratic revolution to completion, i.e. not stopping at halfway compromises with the autocracy. None imagined an immediate socialist revolution. End footnote. 1 second. And footnote, where am I? Alright, sorry. It is worth quoting the full distinction which Trotsky then made between his and Parvis's views in order to grasp the radical manner in which Trotsky, alone amongst all Russian Marxists, proposed to connect backwardness directly with a Marxist revolution. Quote, Parvis was not of the opinion that a workers' government in Russia could move in the direction of the socialist revolution. That is, that in the process of fulfilling the democratic tasks, the workers' government could grow over into the socialist dictatorship. ... Parvis confined the tasks of the workers' government to the democratic tasks. The democratic tasks. ... What Parvis had in mind even at that time was the establishment of a workers' regime after the, quote, Australian, end quote, model. ... That is, ... a regime in which the Workers' Party does indeed govern but does not rule and carries out its reformist demands only as a supplement to the program of the bourgeoisie. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote, it should be added, however, that although this is not an incorrect representation of Parvis's views, Parvis also expected the transition to socialism to become more likely because, quote, democratic tasks, end quote, were to be carried out by a workers' government. End footnote. That Trotsky, who always acknowledged his intellectual indebtedness to Parvis, nevertheless emphasized their differences was not due to some academic concern for historical precision. Footnote. Trotsky's tributes to Parvis were noted in Chapter 1 and in Note 30 of the same chapter. And footnote. The distinction between Trotsky's and Parvis's conception of the workers' government was crucial. The point was that, in Trotsky's view, a workers' government could not confine itself to, quote, democratic tasks, end quote, or, quote, reformist demands. For two reasons. Firstly, because the opposition it would encounter, by virtue of being a workers' government, could be confronted and overcome only by a greater control and transformation of society, and this could be achieved only through the introduction of state and collectivist measures. Secondly, because the most pressing social and economic problems of Russia could not be solved through purely democratic reforms. Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, by basing itself on the peculiar nature of Russia's backwardness, sought to explain the logic of these reasons within their actual geographical and historical context. Here, in fact, was the link which Trotsky claimed to perceive between the old world and the new, between backwardness and socialism. It is important, therefore, to examine the significance which Trotsky attached to these particular reasons. The matter is best dealt with by raising again the main conclusion Trotsky had reached when asking himself, in the course of his survey of Russian society, what it is that had made revolution in Russia inevitable. The short answer Trotsky had given may be paraphrased as follows. A regime which itself had set in motion economic and demographic changes was unprepared to countenance the necessary social and political changes which must follow. Determined to modernize a part of Russia's productive capacities, it yet shied away from any real modernization which went beyond the purely technical industrial sphere, or that part of it in which it was interested. But the middle course it chose was the worst from every point of view. On the one hand, such changes as were introduced were sufficient to undermine, though not transform, the traditional character of Russia, and thus create new social forces, new needs, and new aspirations. On the other, they were insufficient to ensure the successful pursuit of the regime's own declared foreign military goals. The result was that internally, it could not cope with increased demands for further change, thus the revolution of 1905 and later 1917, and externally it could not cope with the threat from its enemies or fulfill its foreign policy ambitions, thus the debacle of the war with Japan and later of the First World War. Although the external threat could be rolled back only through a response to the internal demands, that is, only through a more complete transformation of Russian society, such a transformation, as the regime rightly recognized, would ultimately end in the virtual liquidation of the regime itself. In short, therefore, the existing socio-political structure was incapable of modernizing Russia. In fact, it had become a fetter upon further development. The concept of modernization, understood as change in accordance with Western and socialist standards or norms, which appears in various unmistakable guises in Trotsky's writings, may be said to emerge as the corollary of Trotsky's concept of backwardness. Is this not what the theory of the permanent revolution was all about? In fact, in the light of the concept of modernization, the full significance of what Trotsky took to be the transition to socialism can be seen to unfold. To return to his fundamental reasons for the inevitability of this transition, the first was that a workers' government would be driven into collectivist measures by its opponents. The second, that such measures were in any case necessary to deal with economic problems. What Trotsky perceived in 1905, and what Trotsky later claimed to see in even more extreme form in 1917, was the problem of the lack of consensus and uniformity which characterizes societies, particularly backward societies, which are in a period of change, disruption, and uprooting. The kind of national consensus which Trotsky attributed to the revolutionary forces in France in 1789 were, Trotsky believed, it was not much the social structure as political institutions which had to be overthrown, was in Trotsky's view impossible in the Russia of 1905 or thereafter. Hence a national uprising but no national revolution. Hence agreement as to what had to be destroyed but no agreement as to what should take its place. Hence a general commitment to change but no commitment to all that a plunge into the modern world implied. At a certain stage of the upheaval, tradition-bound forces, the nobility, the bourgeoisie, above all the peasantry, would rebel against the revolution itself. State or collectivist measures would have to be implemented, because to stop short of these would be to stop short of actual modernization. It would be, at best, to limit modernization to minimal agrarian reforms, at worst to return to the status quo ante. Without consensus, without agreement about the future, a dictatorship of the workers, the only force prepared and capable of carrying out modernization, becomes essential and inevitable. The complete transformation of a changed but still backward society becomes the prerogative of a new state power. Thus Trotsky believed collectivist measures, supported by state power, would be a substitute for national consensus, would provide the far-reaching control and domination necessary to pull Russia out of her past. End quote. Sorry, not end quote. Footnote. Not end quote, footnote. The implications of this, which are to become only too clear after 1917, are discussed in part 2 of this study. Besides, there was, in Trotsky's view, no other way of dealing with even the most fundamental economic problems. Here, too, Trotsky may be seen to have been stipulating a condition arising from Trotsky's conception of what modernization in a backward society involved. Put succinctly, Trotsky recognized that the problems of agriculture had become inseparable from the problems of industry and vice versa. The solution to the one dictated the solution to the other. A simple distribution of land was inconceivable. Were it to go uncontrolled, not only would chaos in agriculture ensue, but industry would remain dependent on the uncertainties of the countryside. The development of industry had to be accompanied both by control over agriculture and a diminution of the agricultural sector. Moreover, since in Trotsky's view, the solution to industrial problems lay in socialization and planning, the agricultural sector would have to be brought into the same collectivist orbit, sooner or later. Thus, the solution of the agrarian problem, carried out in the 20th century, that is, in the presence of industry, assumes a completely different character from its solution elsewhere, in a pre-industrial era. Thus, a long-delayed peasant uprising, led not by the bourgeoisie as in the past, but by the proletariat, cannot conclude with a 17th or 18th century settlement of the land problem, and the historical juxtaposition of an agricultural and an industrial revolt leads to a specifically 20th century revolution. In the passage which follows, Trotsky, writing after 1917, isolated this phenomenon as the key to what eventually occurred in Russia. Quote, "The law of combined development of backward countries in the sense of a peculiar mixture of backward elements with the most modern factors, here rises before us in its most finished form, and offers a key to the fundamental riddle of the Russian Revolution. If the agrarian problem, as a heritage from the barbarism of the old Russian history, had been solved by the bourgeoisie, it could have been solved by the bourgeoisie. The Russian proletariat could not possibly have come to power in 1917. If it could have been solved by the Russian bourgeoisie, the Russian proletariat could not possibly have come to power in 1917. In order to realize the Soviet state, there was required a drawing together and mutual penetration of two factors, belonging to completely different historic species: a peasant war, that is, a movement characteristic of the dawn of bourgeois development, and a proletariat insurrection, the development signaling its decline. That is the essence of 1917, end quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution, Book 1. And we may add, the quote essence, end quote, of Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution is that, taking the combined nature of backward development as its point of departure, it sought to explain the mechanism, both historical and political, which governed the coincidence of two revolutions in time. Perhaps, after all, Trotsky should have named it from the outset the theory of the, quote, combined revolution, end quote. Marx believed that capitalism was a, quote, universalizing, end quote, force, bringing all those whom capitalism touched within capitalism's orbit, creating, as Marx said, quote, a world after its own image, end quote. There was a great deal of truth in this, of course, in the sense that no country subject to the impact of Europe could long remain shut off within its own past. The irony was, however, that it was not so much capitalism as such as capitalism's negation, the idea of socialism, and in particular the Marxist idea of socialism, when translated into a political movement, which was to bring not a few backward countries, and first of all, Russia, within the orbit of, quote, universal history, or rather within the orbit of modern modes of economic production and social organization. In the event, of course, and as we have seen Trotsky argue, the ultimate impact of capitalism was not to create, quote, a world after its own image, end quote. Could a world in those backward countries come into being, however, after the image of socialism? The view that the Russian Revolution was what is sometimes called the, quote, revolution of modernization, end quote, has by now a long tradition in Western scholarship. Footnote. See, for example, John H. Kautsky's Political Change in Underdeveloped Countries, published in 1962. Don't see any description for that book. And the same author's Communism and the Politics of Development, published in 1968. Okay, it looks like there's a description for that one. No, I think I lied about that. I don't think there is a description for it. Okay. Yeah, I don't see that. Wait, it looks like there's some kind of description here. I don't know if it's an official description. It says, study of communist strategy within the framework of economic development, with particular reference to developing countries, covers the role of USSR and the role of China in development of the Communist Political Party in developing countries, the role of intellectuals in social change, etc., and includes a case study of post-war development of Indian Communist Party strategy. And footnote. Back to the text. It says, Barrington Moore Jr., Soviet politics, the dilemmas of power, the role of ideas in social change. It just says, a distinguished contribution both to the understanding of Soviet society and to the development of a more mature social science. Next in the list is Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy by Barrington Moore Jr. It says, the description for this book says, this classic work of comparative history explores why some countries have developed as democracies and others as fascist or communist dictatorships. Originally published in 1966, this classic text is a comparative survey of some of what Barrington Moore considers the major and most indicative world economies as they evolved out of a pre-modern political system into industrialism. But Moore is not ultimately concerned with explaining economic development as much as exploring why modes of development produced different political forms that managed the transition to industrialism and modernization. Why did one society modernize in a, quote, relatively free, democratic society, by which Moore means England? Why did others metamorphose into fascist or communist states? Moore's core thesis is that in each country the relationship between the landlord class and the peasants was a primary influence in the ultimate form of government the society arrived at upon its modern age. Alright, so that's that book. Back to the text. And, Adam B. Ulam's The Unfinished Revolution. The description for Ulam's The Unfinished Revolution, Marxism and Communism in the Modern World, says, Marxism has been the most pervasive and widespread ideological phenomenon of our times, but seldom, if ever, has Marxism been found in its form. Whenever the Marxist ideology has been historically significant, it has been so as a beneficiary and associate of another set of political beliefs and passions. As a contender for power, Marxist ideology seeks to express the dreams and yearnings of societies caught in the painful process of modernization and industrialization. In power, Marxist ideology tends to pay lip service to its lofty goals, but associates them with old-fashioned nationalism. Practice does not reflect theory. Ruling elites and parties surpass traditional capitalism in their dedication to political centralization and industrialism at all costs. The revised edition of Adam Ulam's standard work retains the author's summary and critique of Marx's historical, economic, and political arguments. Adam Ulam then examines the relationship of Marxism to other schools of contemporary socialism and to other radical and revolutionary theories. Ulam traces the development of Marxian thought, explains why it has been the potent force in certain societies, while in other societies its influence has been insignificant, and analyzes how Marxism and Leninism have affected the shaping of Russian communism. Finally, Ulam looks at Marxism in the future, the role Marxism will play in the development of the Soviet Union, and how it would affect the contemporary crisis of liberal institutions in the West. That book's published in 1960. And the last book is titled Why Lenin, Why Stalin? A Reappraisal of the Russian Revolution, 1900 to 1930. It doesn't really say anything. Can't really find any description on that. So, back to the text. We have tried to show that it was already inherent in fact, the core of Trotsky's theory of the Russian Revolution before that event actually materialized, and that it derived from elements present but not fully worked out in Marxist thought itself. Still, Marx was not so much concerned with modernization, which Marx considered the product largely of capitalism, as of the social and moral framework within which modernization had now to be accommodated, namely the presumably classless and free society of socialism. Having modernized its methods of social production and having thereby made possible the solution to all economic problems, society, Marx believed, could now, quote, modernize, that is, transform accordingly, society's social human relations. It is for this reason that Marx was skeptical about the prospects of socialism in backward countries. Material change, modernization of the means and capacities for production was both a practical precondition of socialism and an ideation, quote, ideational one, since the need for and the consciousness of socialism arose only in the wake of the possibilities and alternatives created by material change itself. Footnote. Marx did not, of course, write a book specifically devoted to modernization, but all his social and economic writings may be seen to be concerned with this subject in one way or another. See in particular Karl Marx, Pre-Capitalist Economic Formations, edited by Erich Hobsbawm, and Marx's Grundrisse. On the theme of modernization in Marx's thought, see Robert C. Tucker's The Marxian Revolutionary Idea. Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution was not only a theory of how material change, modernization in this sense, could be brought about in a backward country. On the contrary, it argued that the modernization of modern conditions should and could proceed hand in hand with their accommodation within the socialist framework of which Marx had spoken. That, in other words, a, quote, socialist psychology, as Trotsky called it, and by which he meant, of course, a socialist consciousness, should and could arise before, or, at best, concurrently with, the creation of both the material preconditions of socialism and the actual conditions themselves of socialism. Thus, the notion of modernization in Trotsky's thought was that of modernization in accordance with both the material and moral precepts of socialism. To return to the question we posed above, Trotsky did believe that a backward country could be remolded in the image of socialism. The problem is, of course, that this belief grew as much out of wishful thinking and questionable assumptions as out of a persuasive theoretical analysis of all the difficulties inherent in the above conception of modernization, in the transformation, that is, of Russia into a socialist society. It is true that Trotsky could always fall back on the crucial condition Trotsky had stipulated, the European Revolution, and, in fact, in later years Trotsky would repeat again and again that Trotsky had always made socialism in Russia dependent on socialism in Europe. But the idea that revolution in Russia would spark off a general conflagration in Europe, which in turn would presumably rescue Russian socialism, was itself a not insubstantial bit of wishful thinking. In the first place, it was based on the assumption, albeit one shared by Marxists in general, that revolutionary socialism was still a force in Europe, as relevant to advanced societies as Trotsky now claimed Marxism to be relevant to backward societies. That Europe could no more solve Europe's problems without revolution than Russia could without revolution. In the second place, it did not have much to do with the question of the possibility of socialism in Russia. Let us, for the sake of argument, grant Trotsky the benefit of the doubt. The view, in any case, that European capitalism in the years prior to World War I was disintegrating. The view later, that the war was the final drama of this disintegration may have proved to be misguided and illusory, but it was not preposterous at the time. Suppose then that the collapse of capitalism would have even seen the emergence of workers' governments in Europe. Would this have made the transition to socialism in Russia that much more certain? No doubt the, quote, direct state support of the European proletariat, end quote, to repeat Trotsky's words in Results and Prospects, would have made life much less complicated for a Russian, quote, workers' government. But this is still to beg the question of whether Russia was, quote, ripe for socialism, of whether socialism could be made to grow on primarily backward foundations. A socialist Europe could certainly assist Russia materially. It is, however, too much to believe that a socialist Europe could make up for Russia's social and cultural limitations. Footnote. The persistent problems confronting underdeveloped countries today, no matter what the extent of the material aid they receive, show that backwardness cannot be overcome by material means alone, or even primarily. End footnote. In point of fact, the theory of the permanent revolution, though it made socialism in Russia ultimately dependent on Europe, was first of all based on certain overly optimistic assumptions about the internal, independent capacities of Russian society. We have argued in the previous chapter that Trotsky, in spite of Trotsky's awareness of the overall poverty, in all its senses, of Russian society, nevertheless exaggerated the extent of socio-cultural changes which had taken place in Russian society by the beginning of the 20th century. Trotsky could hardly do otherwise and sound convincing, for not to assume such changes was to project socialism into a virtual vacuum. And, after all, the whole point of the theory of the permanent revolution, as of the notion of, quote, combined development, end quote, was that a basis for socialism had already been created. On the other hand, not even Trotsky could argue, since this was preposterous, that this basis was such as emerges with the evolution of society towards socialism, a basis Marx had assumed to arise in the, quote, womb of capitalist society, as capitalist society, quote, transcended, end quote, itself. Here it is not difficult to see the kind of position to which Trotsky's theory actually committed Trotsky, though without Trotsky realizing it. What, after all, is the purpose, the function, of revolution in the Marxist view of things? Let us leave aside the question, which cannot be dealt with here, and which has been much debated in the literature on Marxism, of what Marx's own overall position on the issue of revolutionary activity was. We have merely touched upon it in the context of some of his 1848 to 50 writings. Footnote. For the view that Marx was very cautious about propounding revolutionary action, see Avineri. End footnote. But in accordance with the general historical theories of Marxism, it can be argued that political revolution is legitimate only when it emerges as the last act, so to speak, of a social revolution. Social revolution is the kind of broad transformation through which a society passes over a, quote, epoch, and as a result largely of internal economic forces outside its control and consciousness. It is once this social revolution has more or less culminated that the question of political revolution arises. It becomes necessary when, despite such changes, old and now inadequate political and other institutions continue, for one reason or another, to persist or maintain themselves, and are a, quote, fetter upon further development. The role of political revolution, in that case, is to force politics and the remnants of the past to conform to the new character of society. This way of looking at the Marxist theory of revolution may be too schematic and an oversimplification, and is certainly at variance with Marxism's own historical role. But it is not incompatible with its historical thesis about politics lagging behind economics and social reality in general. Footnote. In his famous summary of his views of history, preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx spoke of the, quote, epoch of social revolution, end quote, and nowhere mentioned the question of a political revolution. However, see the critical analysis of this, quote, preface, which exposes the vagueness of its concepts, in John Plemenat's German Marxism and Russian Communism. The description that I'm seeing for this German Marxism and Russian Communism book by John Plemenats. So it says John Plemenats lived from 1912 to 1975, was born in Montenegro. John Plemenats, his father, a political activist, was forced to leave the country in 1917, and Plemenats was sent to England, where he was educated and became a naturalized citizen. John Plemenats was a political philosopher and spent most of his academic life at the University of Oxford. John Plemenats' specialty was political theory with an emphasis on Marxism and communism in his published writings. This work, German Marxism and Russian Communism, is critical of Marxism, whose assumptions Plemenats thinks are confused and not consistent with facts. Plemenats then discusses how Russian communism evolved from Marxism in a distorted way to promote a proletarian revolution in a country that was much less industrialized than Germany. An interesting analysis from the early days of the Cold War, very scarce in the United States in the original 1954 edition. So I don't know if that's an actual I don't know if that's an actual description or just a description from this miscellaneous bookstore that I found it at, but we'll see. I mean, well, we won't see, but what's the word I was looking for? Who knows? End footnote. Now, it is obviously true that by the beginning of the 20th century, Russian political and other institutions were no longer adequate, and were incompatible with the changes which had taken place in Russian society. A case for political revolution can, accordingly, be not unreasonably made out even on non-Marxist grounds. But the nature of the institutional changes required depended, of course, on the nature of the economic and social changes which had emerged. Thus, it was common to speak of the need for, quote, democratic institutions as being the most logical at that point in Russia's development. It is true, of course, and is the most persuasive, that the most cogently argued approach in Trotsky's thought, that such a purely formalistic approach neglected the fact that Russian development did not conform to the preconditions which would make democratic institutions viable. Conversely, however, to argue that a socialist government, socialist institutions were on the order of the day was to argue that a political revolution had to precede the social revolution. The institutions had to be created which not only did not have roots in social life, but took precedence over social life. Trotsky had in fact committed himself to the view that socialism was to be imposed from above, that state institutions would carry out the revolution which society itself was either incapable of or unprepared to give birth to, that, in a word, revolution would make society conform to politics and to political ideology, a curious and far-reaching reversal of the Marxist view of historical change. We know that this is precisely what was eventually to happen, that the Soviet government was to pursue, at first hesitantly but at last unrelentingly, a policy of the willful transformation of society from above. No one, however, perhaps not even Lenin, who is commonly identified with this approach to politics, which Stalin later perfected, was more responsible for providing it with its initial theoretical justification than Trotsky. It is not surprising, therefore, that following 1905, Trotsky was looked upon as somewhat of a reckless adventurist, a revolutionist par excellence. Even Lenin thought Trotsky too extreme, though Lenin may have been worried as much by the practical possibilities of Trotsky's ideas as their ideological pedigree. Footnote. As has often been noted, In September 1905, Lenin momentarily entertained the possibility that Russia might have her democratic and socialist revolutions simultaneously, and even propounded that this be the goal of the Social Democrats. Thus Lenin wrote, quote, "From this democratic revolution we shall begin immediately, and within the extent of our strength, the strength of the conscious and organized proletariat, to go on to the socialist revolution. We stand for uninterrupted revolution. We shall not stop halfway," end quote. Lenin. But this seems to have been an impulsive reaction to the events of 1905, for almost immediately thereafter Lenin returned to the orthodox view that Russia must first go through a bourgeois revolution before there could be talk of a socialist revolution, a view Lenin would uphold until 1917. In The Permanent Revolution, Trotsky claimed that Lenin never read his Results and Prospects or other writings on the theory of permanent revolution. By this, Trotsky wanted to show that Lenin was both unacquainted with the theory and never actually rejected it. In fact, of course, Lenin's whole position was at odds with that of Trotsky, and Trotsky's attempt in Permanent Revolution to blur the differences between them is hardly to the credit of his historical or intellectual integrity. End footnote. As for Trotsky was of course not unaware of the revolutionary activism to which Trotsky alone for a long time was committed. There is an interesting and revealing passage in an article of 1908 where Trotsky summarizes the differences between the Menshevik and Bolshevik factions and, implicitly, between them and himself. Quote, "Whereas the Mensheviks, proceeding from the abstract notion that, quote, our revolution is a bourgeois revolution, end quote, arrive at the idea that the proletariat must adapt all its tactics to the behavior of the liberal bourgeoisie in order to ensure the transfer of state power to that bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks proceed from an equally abstract notion, quote, democratic dictatorship, not socialist dictatorship, end quote, and arrive at the idea of a proletariat in possession of state power imposing a bourgeois democratic limitation upon itself. It is true that the difference between them in this matter is very considerable. While the anti-revolutionary aspects of Menshevism have already become fully apparent, those of Bolshevism are likely to become a serious threat to the event of victory. In the event of victory. Both Mensheviks and Bolsheviks become scared of the consequences of the class struggle and hope to limit the class struggle by the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks' metaphysical constructs." End quote. Trotsky, 1905. This is the article referred to in Note 102 above. The passage quoted is quite prescient if we recall the vacillation of the Bolsheviks before Lenin's arrival in Petrograd in April 1917. In 1922, when including the article in 1905, Trotsky added the footnote at the bottom of the same page, quote, "This threat, bracket, i.e. that Bolshevism will prove to be, quote, scared," end quote, end bracket, as we know, never materialized because, under the leadership of Comrade Lenin, the Bolsheviks, though not without an internal struggle, revamped their policy on this fundamental question in the spring of 1917, that is, before the seizure of power, end quote. See also a letter he wrote in 1921 where, while reaffirming the correctness of his theory of the permanent revolution and declaring that in his differences with the Bolsheviks, Trotsky had, quote, bracket, not been, end bracket, wrong on everything, end quote, Trotsky admitted that he had drawn, quote, incorrect, end quote, conclusions about the revolutionary potential of the Bolshevik faction. End footnote. It remains true, however, that Trotsky never saw the implication of his revolutionary theory in the manner in which they have been here interpreted, and the extreme materialization of which he would in later years devote himself to denouncing. It remains true also that, despite what has been said here, there is a fundamental difference in character and mentality between Trotsky and Lenin, not to mention Stalin. Why is it that Trotsky appears to us to have been more genuinely attached to the ideals of socialism than either Lenin or Stalin, or rather to that conception of a modern Russia which took due account of both material and moral conditions? The answer to this As to the question why Trotsky did not see the implications of his ideas, is that these ideas were not formulated as an exercise in ideological justification, but out of a conviction that they scrupulously reflected Russian reality. Thus, Trotsky did genuinely believe that reality was ready to absorb socialist ideas and a, quote, workers' government. Thus, Trotsky genuinely believed, above all, in the vitality of the Russian proletariat. Earlier in this study, we noted Trotsky's reaction to the workers' participation in the Revolution of 1905 and the impact of this upon him. In fact, the whole of Trotsky's exaggerated view of the extent to which Russia had been transformed by industrialization may be attributed to Trotsky's conviction, which must now appear either perverse or simply naive, that the Russian proletariat was an independent, vital revolutionary force, both in the sense of the Russian proletariat's economic-based political strength, as well as that of the Russian proletariat's consciousness, idealism, and devotion to socialist goals. Footnote: another Marxist who believed in workers' consciousness and participation, and upon whom the events of 1905 in Russia also had a profound impact, was Rosa Luxemburg. See her 1906 pamphlet, The Mass Strike, The Political Party and the Trade Unions, English version reissued, New York, 1971. In Trotsky's autobiography, My Life, Trotsky claimed that Rosa Luxemburg in 1907, at the 5th Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in London, which Rosa Luxemburg attended, agreed with his theory of the permanent revolution. Deutscher repeats this claim as fact without providing any further evidence for it. There are, of course, many affinities between Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg, but no basis in fact to show that Rosa Luxemburg was a proponent of permanent revolution. Rosa Luxemburg's above-mentioned pamphlet reveals an awareness of the peculiar rapidity of developments in Russia, but there is no suggestion in it that Russia is ripe for a socialist revolution. Nor does her 1905 Neue Zeit article Nach dem Ersten Akt from the 4th of February 1905, in which Luxemburg speaks of maintaining the Russian Revolution, quote, in permanence, end quote, reveal any adoption of Trotsky's standpoint. As was pointed out earlier, Rosa Luxemburg argued only that the democratic, i.e. bourgeois revolution, be perpetuated until all its demands had been met and the autocracy brought down. Rosa Luxemburg's biographer also finds no basis for Trotsky's or Deutscher's claim. See J.P. Nettle, Rosa Luxemburg, 2 volumes. Also check out the review by Paul Maddox Sr. on this channel of J.P. Nettle's Rosa Luxemburg. I want to read Nettle's Rosa Luxemburg, but I haven't. Only after 1917 could Luxemburg, like Lenin, be said to have approached a position similar to Trotsky's. See her pamphlet, The Russian Revolution, written in 1918, which, however, is also a far-reaching critique of Bolshevik policies. In later years, Trotsky embraced Rosa Luxemburg as a, quote, spiritual light under the Fourth International. See also Trotsky's article, Something in Russian. For an earlier tribute to her, see the speech Trotsky delivered in the Petrograd Soviet in January 1919, following Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht's murder. End footnote. So this also explains Trotsky's attitude from the time of the fateful Second Congress of Russian Social Democrats in 1903 and until 1917 to the question of Russian organization and of the relationship in general between masses and party. If what Trotsky believed about Russian workers was true, then the theory of the permanent revolution had no need to take undue account of the organizational instrument which would set the mechanism of the revolution in motion. The workers themselves, Trotsky thought, were the instrument, the agent, and the vehicle of social change. Thus the issue we have discussed above, of a political revolution imposed from above, did not arise from Trotsky, for the revolution would be of the workers themselves, and, indeed, this accounts for Trotsky's bitter and unequivocal opposition to Lenin. And indeed, this accounts for Trotsky's bitter and unequivocal opposition to Lenin until 1917, an opposition which grew precisely out of the fact that Trotsky considered, not incorrectly, Lenin's conception of the party to represent an attempt to impose the revolution from above. It was Lenin, of course, who was to take the first step towards a possible reconciliation with Trotsky. Though Lenin's famous April Theses of 1917 were obviously not governed by this consideration, the April Theses of 1917 enabled Trotsky to think that on the question of the permanent revolution, the two were now of one mind. Footnote: the second of Lenin's theses declared, quote, "It is a specific feature of the present situation in Russia that it represents a transition from the first stage of the revolution, which, owing to the insufficient class consciousness and organization of the proletariat, placed power in the hands of the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which must place power in the hands of the proletariat and the poorest sections of the peasants," end quote. Lenin. For an assessment of Lenin's volte-face of April 1917, see Jonathan Frankel's Lenin's Doctrinal Revolution of April 1917 in the Journal of Contemporary History, April 1969. Although in 1915 Lenin had spoken of the, quote, "growing over" of the bourgeois into the socialist revolution, see Meyer, Leninism, and Trotsky, Permanent Revolution, Lenin's April Theses represent a sudden and complete change of view. One second. One second. Lenin's April Theses represent a sudden and complete change of view, i.e. an abandonment of the traditional, quote, "different and separate stages," end quote, theory. While it is true that Lenin never identified himself directly with Trotsky's theory of the permanent revolution, in effect his, quote, "theses" were tantamount to an acceptance of the theory. In My Life, Book 2, Trotsky writes that A. Yoffe had once told Trotsky about a conversation Yoffe had with Lenin in 1919 on the subject of the permanent revolution, and according to Yoffe, Lenin had said, quote, "yes, Trotsky proved to be right," end quote. Trotsky quotes from the letter Yoffe wrote Trotsky before committing suicide in November 1927, quote, "With my own ears I heard Lenin admit that even in 1905, you and not he were right," end quote. The full text of Yoffe's letter is reproduced in Trotsky, The Real Situation in Russia, New York, 1928. See also Trotsky's reference to the conversation between Yoffe and Lenin in Permanent Revolution. There can be no doubt that Lenin's, quote, "conversion," end quote, in 1917 was a typical example of Lenin's theoretical flexibility, or to put it another way, of his capacity and readiness to abandon old doctrines for new doctrines more suited to the needs of the moment, in this case the need for a theoretical justification for the seizure of power. If Lenin's approach to theory in 1917 was opportunistic, this cannot be said of Trotsky, who, after all, had propounded the permanent theory since 1905, although an element of opportunism was certainly present in Trotsky's conversion to Bolshevism. In general, it may be said that the approach of the two men to theory and doctrine was fundamentally different, that of Lenin being consistently instrumental. This also explains the fact that whatever Lenin's identification with Trotsky's theory, in later years, Lenin would be less reliant than Trotsky on a European revolution and more prepared to pursue internal policies irrespective of external developments. In the 1920s and 1930s, Trotsky would argue that Stalinism was a deviation from Leninism. As we shall see, there would be much exaggeration in this argument. Thus, Trotsky is probably right to claim that Lenin had embraced the theory of the permanent revolution. But Trotsky attributed too much importance to this, assuming that Lenin had thereby committed himself to all that he, Trotsky, saw as flowing from this theory. After 1917, Trotsky never quite grasped Lenin's political mentality and acumen. End footnote. I want to read the description for Alfred G. Mayer's Leninism. And this is for, I guess this is a clip from the introduction, but it's on Google Books. So, the importance of an understanding of Leninism, which denotes the thought not only of Lenin himself, but also of his associates. For a grasp of contemporary world affairs needs no elaboration, although the mark it will make in the development of social thought in the very long run is probably being underestimated. At the same time, even among those who consider it important to become acquainted with Leninism, there is by no means agreement about the reasons why we should study it. It is indisputable that the ideas and behavior traditions of V.I. Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, have caught the imagination of millions in our day and represent the official holy writ for the subjects of caste empires, comprising over a third of the Earth's population. But the task of making a broad survey of Leninism is made difficult by a number of factors. Based on a philosophy that is uncongenial to thinkers in our culture, Leninism comprised a set of uncomfortable and highly controversial ideas, the very preoccupation with which can serve today to compromise a writer. Since Leninism is at the same time deceptively crude and simple, at least in the way in which its advocates are wont to propound it, many students of political thought tend to consider Leninism unworthy of serious attention. Hence, instead of inquiring what Leninism is, our social scientists have more often asked themselves why anyone might be prompted to turn to these ideas and follow them. The relevancy of any study of Leninism has been questioned. Its appeal has indeed been noted, and its official acceptance as virtual dogma in the entire communist world is acknowledged, but there is a good deal of dispute over the effectiveness of Leninist ideas even in this communist world. The extreme flexibility of Leninism makes it possible for communist leaders to justify almost any policy by pulling a set of suitable quotations from the grab bag of Lenin's pronouncements. Hence the conviction is widespread that Leninism has turned into a dead letter, in no way determining the actions of communist leaders, whether they are in command of a revolutionary party or manage an established regime. Back to the text. Yet nothing so bears witness to Trotsky's overestimation of the workers and of mass consciousness, and perhaps to his own eventual though unstated recognition of this fact, as the actual motive for his reconciliation with Lenin and with Bolshevism. In the midst of 1917, it must have become obvious to Trotsky that the mechanism of the permanent revolution could not be set in motion without a revolutionary organization. In the theory of that revolution, the party proved to be the missing link, or, since Trotsky had considered it superfluous, the rejected link. If, therefore, in 1917, Lenin tacitly or at least accepted Trotsky's theory of the Russian Revolution, the problem of the missing link explains why, in the same year, the theory could not be put into practice without Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Footnote. Trotsky, of course, took October 1917 to be a vindication of his theory. Of his numerous claims to this effect, see, for example, The Permanent Revolution, where Trotsky declares, quote, "The fundamental train of thought which I developed 23 years ago in Results and Prospects, I consider confirmed by events as completely correct," end quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. End footnote. But the extent to which the recognition and the acceptance of this fact by Trotsky involved a radical transformation in Trotsky's thought in general, and in Trotsky's attitude to party organization in particular, will become even more apparent in a full consideration of his earlier views on the role and importance of the Revolutionary Party. All right, that's it. Thank you for listening.